module was named America and the lunar module Challenger. They launched in December of 1972 and had a record-breaking mission. These include, and still stand, longest manned lunar landing flight, longest lunar extravehicular activities, largest lunar sample return, a geologist, are you kidding? And the longest time in lunar orbit that landed with a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean less than half a mile from the target point. As such, he is the second to last man to walk on the moon to date. There are only 12 men who can be called moonwalkers. 6 of these heroes remain. Dr. Schmitt retired from NASA in 1975 to run for the U.S. Senate for New Mexico, where he served a 6-year term. Since then, he's worked as a consultant, corporate director, a freelance writer, and speaker. It gives me great pleasure and a distinct honor to introduce to you one of my personal heroes, Dr. Harrison Schmitt.
Thank you. We're going to take a very fast trip to the moon this morning and then have a chance for some questions. But first, I'd like Melanie to come back up here. You know, she's done a fantastic job of organizing this particular event. And Melanie, that's for you. It's some little items related to space, not from space. Okay? Give her a big... How many of you... I must be under a speaker. How many of you might like to really go to the moon one of these days? Huh? That's pretty good. Pretty good crowd. How about Mars? Huh? Oh, got a few more from Mars. Well, and just to remind you, some of you of that, I have a few soft pieces of the moon here. Sorry, that's it. What you're going to see here is a sequential summary of what it took to get to the moon, at least for Apollo 17. The movie will start out with some aspects of an introduction of the missions that went to the moon. It will show you a little bit of the training, and then we'll get on with the launch and so forth. So hang on a second while I get this started. These are the images of the patches, the logos of each of the missions. There were 6 landings on the moon. The first being, of course, Apollo 11, and the last, Apollo 17. Apollo 13, which is up there right now, is a very famous one. It was a successful mission in that we recovered the crew after an explosion of an oxygen tank. Landing on the moon was really a remarkable experience for all of the astronauts. This little sequence here you'll see again. One of the more exciting aspects of our mission was my discovery of volcanic ash that was orange in color, and we will talk some more about that in a few moments. Sampling here you see is really a joint activity between the 2 astronauts. Training actually took us down to Kilburn Hole in southern New Mexico, one of our trips. And each of those training trips, we tried to simulate the activities that we would have on the moon using the equipment such as the lunar rover. This is called the rover. And there you see the backpack and all the equipment. But we also did that training on real geological problems. We also had survival training down in Panama. You see several, Ed Mitchell, myself, and Ron Evans. And part of that training took us down the river in Panama that you may be familiar with from the Panama Canal. Suiting up was the last contact we had with anyone other than ourselves on the mission. And here's Al Shepard, my boss at the time, and the first American in space, trying to talk to me through that helmet. It wasn't very successful. Now, headed out to the launch pad and to the van. I seem to have forgotten where the elevator was, or saw somebody that I knew and might even have dated. And tried to get out, but Charlie luckily was not having any. This is the white room where Gunter Vent and his crew were the last to say goodbye to us, and then we had the launch. That Saturn V weighed 6.5 million pounds, fully fueled at this point. The thrust was 7.5 million pounds, and we reached a total acceleration of 4.5 Gs. Now that's not too bad, except just imagine trying to lift your arm when it's 4.5 times its normal weight. It gets your attention. Plus there was a great deal of vibration in the launch. Ron Evans docked with the Lunar Module Challenger. He was our command module pilot, stayed in orbit around the moon. That docking was really excellently performed, and we were ready then to take that spacecraft to the moon, which we had to have in order to land, of course. On the way out, we were able to see the Earth for 3.5 days. I have always been interested in weather, and I spent a great deal of time talking about the weather patterns and trying to forecast what I would see the next 24 hours. The Earth, of course, was rotating beneath us because we were in what's called a lunar reference trajectory. That is, we were tied to the moon right as soon as we left Earth orbit. This is the Valley of Taurus Littrow, where our landing point was going to be. And this, of course, is the Challenger now with its landing gear extended and headed down to the surface. Pitch over was at 8,000 feet above the surface of the moon. And if you look carefully now, you'll see our shadow appearing at the edge of that large crater, the crater named Camelot, in honor of John Kennedy's challenge to us to go to the moon. And then as we got closer to the surface, actually about 100 feet above the surface, you could see the dust, but not a lot. We could see boulders through that screen of dust as it sped away from the descent mission. The first view I had out of the right-hand window is this one, looking at those mountains over there about 3.5 miles away. Now, Gene Cernan asked me to come over, and on our first EVA, he was drilling a deep hole, and we had trouble getting that out of the ground. If anybody wants to ask me why, I can answer that later. But you can see, I don't think Gene would ever ask me to come over and help him again. Your center of gravity, remember, we're 1/6 gravity, and so actually getting up and down was not too difficult, but maintaining your balance and keeping samples from falling out of that sack was a little more difficult. Now, you'll see me get up here, which all it required was leaning back a little bit, up, but hanging on that stupid bag was a little more difficult. About this time, I heard from Bob Parker, who was the capsule communicator on our mission, telling me that he had received a great number of calls from the Houston Ballet Society. So I decided I better give them a little bit of an audition, and this is the best I could do. And of course, the camera lens went into the dust, and so we had to clean that up. We were at about, I've already talked to you a little bit about the orange soil. This is the location of the orange soil. It's in the rim of an impact crater, meteor impact crater, about 80 meters in diameter. And CERN was got a little bit excited when it finally realized I had indeed found the orange volcanic ash. It turns out that ash is a very important sample. It relates not only to the volcanism that occurred on the moon, but also to the origin of the moon itself. And in some of the little tiny beads of that glass, you'll see here in a moment, we've actually found water, indigenous water that came from the interior of the moon. And that has sort of revolutionized a lot of thinking about the composition of the moon and just how it formed. Again, we worked there you go. This is a slightly, it's not even as orange as it looked to me when I had the sun directly on it. But you can see that in that little half trench that I dug, that it was quite orange with light-colored material on either side. This is a photomicrograph of those orange beads taken through, of course, a microscope. And so you can see that they are indeed small beads. This is a science support room. Jim Lovell was, of Apollo 13 fame, was running that room for us and giving us advice if they could just keep up. It was a little hard for them to keep up. Remember, it's about a 1.5 second time delay because of the distance to the moon. The pilot astronauts, like Commander CERN, for some reason like this hopping motion to go across the surface. That didn't work out too well. I'll show you my preferred technique here in a few moments. Now, we've taken some of the video from our trip and compiled it into panoramas. And so these look a little strange because every once in a while you'll see the astronauts. It looks like there are 4 or 5 or 6 astronauts on the moon. There really are only 2 because the compilation of this video. I kept my visor up a bit so you can see my face. It's one of the few faces you'll see on the surface of the moon. I just wanted to be sure I could see all the colors of the rocks carefully without the visor. The visor actually had a thin film of gold on it to protect from ultraviolet radiation. Now this is my downhill skiing technique that you'll see here. Not too good, a little hard to get a hip rotation. At this point I caught an edge and almost went down. I needed another pole actually. I guess all I had was this scoop that was my sampling. The valley itself was deeper than the Grand Canyon. The mountains on either side went to, like the South Massif there, was 7,000 feet high above the valley. So it was very deep, but it's hard to tell distances. There's a lunar module way off, about 3.5 miles away from where this picture was taken. The reason it's hard to tell distances is there's nothing to compare it with. There are no telephone poles or houses or anything like that. And so it turns out that all the astronauts underestimated how far things were from them. Now here you're going to, in a minute, you're going to see, this is the preferred technique for running on the moon. It's a cross-country skiing technique, actually. And those of you who might have done some cross-country skiing will know what I'm doing here. A little bit of a toe push and glide above the surface, of course, not upon it. At this point, I had a great deal of confidence, and I was running through a boulder field. The various stations that we selected before flight turned out to be ideal for collecting samples. People asked me, would you have done anything differently, knowing what you know now? And actually, it's hard to pin down any particular station that would have been, you would have added or subtracted. Now, this is getting close to time to leave the moon. You can see just the running over towards the lunar module. The camera now is on the lunar rover, parked about 300 meters away, and we're ready for liftoff. Commander Cernan tried to get me to go outside and get a really good picture of liftoff, and I decided that might not be a good idea. Now looking back down out of the cabin, you can see our tracks and the descent stage of the Challenger. And I'm going to fade into a picture that was taken fairly recently by a spacecraft actually in orbit still in the moon. That's our landing site. And one of the exciting things is the flag is still casting a shadow. The flag that we deployed. You'll see that again here in a few moments. Rendezvous with Ron Evans went very smoothly and very quickly. And Ron then, on the way back home, went outside the spacecraft on what's called a weightless EVA in order to collect some canisters of various cameras and things that he had been operating while we were on the surface. If you look carefully here in a minute, you'll see my head pop up in the lower left. I was taking some pictures of Ron so he would have something for his photo album. Ron passed away a number of years ago, but did an outstanding job. Well, we entered the atmosphere at about 25,000 miles an hour. It took a while to get the parachutes out at about 10,000 feet. Then we splashed down in the Pacific, not too far from the island of Samoa. The helicopters were there to pick us up, along with the Navy SEALs, who put a safety collar around the spacecraft just in case some rogue wave came along. And then we were brought up to the helicopter in this rescue vessel. We all were a little bit unsteady on our feet, as you'll notice here. We reached to get balance, and then walking down that red carpet was a little difficult, having spent 2 weeks in space, but we gradually got used to it. But believe me, I concentrated hard. I didn't want to fall down in the front of the captain and the admiral that were there. We were greeted by a number of congressmen who came out for the trip, including Senator Barry Goldwater, who was there. That's the flag we deployed on the moon, a tribute to the taxpayer of the United States and to the success of the Apollo program. This really was a remarkable time in human history. It was obviously the original space program, Apollo program, was part of the Cold War conflict between democracy and the then Soviet Union. But it was one that was carried out very successfully, and I was very honored to participate in it. These are the men who landed on the moon. And with that, let's move into taking some questions. You want to, Melanie, you want to help me identify people who are asking some questions?
All right, thank you, Dr. Schmitt. So I'm the official runner, and I'll be getting my 10,000 steps in. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll come over and you can speak into the microphone.
Let's work in the back. Let's work in the back first with the kids. All right?
Yep. Okay.
Excuse me. We'll get back.
Oh, you're fine.
How were the 6 Apollo lunar sites chosen?
How were the Apollo lunar sites chosen? That was done initially for Apollo 11, the first landing on the moon, and for Apollo 12, by looking at the equatorial part of the moon, the central part of the moon, where the difficulties in navigation would be minimized, and we had concentrated the photography, pre-Apollo photography from a spacecraft called the Lunar Orbiter, to get as high a resolution photographs of various sites as we could. And the sites we initially picked were spaced about 2 launch days apart across the face of the moon. And so initially it was just to try to maximize the probability of success of the landing. Once we had Apollo 11 landed, and there were some difficulties in knowing exactly where Apollo 11 landed. And so the Apollo 12 landing site was geared primarily to establish a pinpoint landing capability. And indeed, the target for Apollo 12 was a surveyor spacecraft, an unmanned robotic spacecraft that had landed on the moon some years before. We knew where it was. We had identified where it was in the photographs that were taken before Apollo 12. And so the whole effort of the mission control system was to try to land as close to that spacecraft as we could. And indeed, Pete Conrad landed within about 100 yards of the surveyor spacecraft. After that, once we had the pinpoint landing capability, then we could broaden our landing site selection, and we did. But each site then was selected after the preceding mission. Once we had some samples back, we understood a little bit more about the history of the moon, that started to guide the candidate landing sites for each of the succeeding missions. Apollo 17's landing site was selected because it was going to be very difficult. We knew we could land there, but it also gave us what geologists love, and that is three-dimensional view into the crust of the moon. And that really was, we picked a complex site because it was time to do that, to try to answer some questions we had, and also we had a field geologist, yours truly, on board who I think served well to understand that particular landing site. And I continue today to work on those samples and the data that's come back from succeeding missions since then.
Dan, we got some guys over here. Dan? Oh.
Do you think there'll ever be like a moon base or space station on the moon?
I have no doubt that there are going to be moon bases on the moon. In fact, I think there will be settlements on the moon, primarily because there's a very important energy resource on the moon that can support the economy of a settlement. It's a light isotope of helium called helium-3. The book that some of you have seen discusses how we might utilize helium-3 here on Earth to produce clean and highly efficient fusion power. We'll just wait and see, but in the long term, I think that will support lunar settlements. And those settlements also will be very important in supplying the consumable resources necessary for those of you that end up going to Mars.
I'm sorry, Louis, maybe turn the lights on?
Well, that's a good idea.
Not working. Well, we have a fancy, Dan.
How long does it take to get to the moon?
How long does it take to get to the moon? With chemical propulsion that we had, it takes about 3.5 days. That's the minimum energy required to get to the moon. It turns out, and you can ask your science teachers about this, but there's what one of my colleagues calls the tyranny of the rocket equation. Look up the rocket equation on Bean or Google. And if the Earth had been just a little bit bigger, we could not use chemical propulsion to get off. Now, we probably have developed nuclear propulsion to get off, but we couldn't use chemical propulsion. But since the Earth is the size it is, we can get off the Earth, but it takes these massive rockets in order to make it happen, like the Saturn V, and like yesterday was the launch of the Falcon 9 Heavy, and it's going to take big rockets. The Heavy, by the way, is about a third the capability of the Saturn V.
I've heard somewhere that like launching a rocket, because of the sound waves of the boosters, you had to put water under it to stop the rocket from shaking and falling apart. Is that true?
We did use, the question is, did we use water in order to keep the rocket from shaking, falling apart? We did use a water deluge in the flame trench underneath the rocket to dampen those acoustical or sound waves. I don't think the rocket would have fallen apart, but maybe the launch pad would have fallen apart if we hadn't done that. And so that is a standard way in which you you reduce the amount of damage that can happen to your launch pad and potentially to the rocket itself, is to use a lot of water. A tremendous amount of water is dumped into that flame trench as the rocket ignites.
Was most of your flight either computer controlled or
It was a flight computer controlled or manual. Primarily, we used computers, but we had a manual backup. We could have guided the rocket into space manually. That was a backup way, but the computer is much more precise, even in those days. And that it just makes sense, even to these pilots who like to fly their airplanes, to have a backup way of doing it. But the primary way that we did it was with computers. Now, landing on the moon, we used the computer to guide us down to about a few hundred feet above the surface, and then we landed manually, because the computer in those days could not sense where the craters and boulders were. And so the human eye does a much better job of that than a computer would. Today, there's probably enough terrain recognition technology in computers, or could be used computers, so indeed you could avoid craters and boulders even with computers. But in the Apollo day, we didn't do it that way. And you always want to have the backup, though. The human backup is always going to be there, I think. And it's very important to make sure, because computers don't always work right. And you need to be ready to take over if it doesn't work. So a lot of our training was indeed to deal with computer failures. We didn't have any, but we trained them.
How many years of training did you go through before you were able to go to the moon?
How many years of training? Well, I became an astronaut in 1965, summer of 65, selected. My job, since I was not a pilot, the first thing I had to do, at least for Apollo, it was changed later, was to learn how to fly jet aircraft. And so I spent a year at Williams Air Force Base over here at Chandler, Arizona, learning to fly T-38s. And then in 1967, I went to helicopter school down in Pensacola, Florida, with the Navy. And so I spent just 2 weeks learning how to fly helicopter, which I didn't believe I could do, but I did, and in 2 weeks. So a lot of part of the early training was becoming a pilot. Interspersed in there, though, was a great deal of training on orbital mechanics, the systems of the various spacecraft, and the like. Once I was selected for a crew, and that was the backup crew of Apollo 15, then we had very specific mission training for about 15 months. And because of a variety of circumstances, I immediately cycled in August of 1970 to the prime crew of Apollo 17. And then another 15 months of training took place until we launched in 72. I think, yeah, I got the months and years mixed up there a little bit. But we launched in December of 72. So the total specific training to fly spacecraft was about 30 months already.
Do you think we'll be able to colonize Mars anytime soon?
Probably not anytime soon. We will, Mars is going to be very difficult. It's not going to be impossible. I have great faith in the engineers that can figure out how to do these things. But Mars has just enough atmosphere to cause problems, and not enough to help you very much. We really did depend on the Earth's atmosphere a great deal in order to slow down the entry spacecraft and to be able to land. Mars doesn't let you do that. And so we're going to have rockets that are very reliable, very energetic, that can burn, as we call it, into the Martian atmosphere. Now that can be done, but it's a major engineering challenge. You only have about, from the time you start your entry on Mars, you're in Mars orbit, and you start to enter, you do a retro burn, and start to enter, you only have about a minute before you're going to have to land. And so you're going to be very dependent on computers. And in fact, for Apollo, if we had a problem during the descent, we would have aborted to come home. We would not have landed. I think when you go to Mars, those of you who do that, we're going to have a different philosophy. I think we're going to abort to land and then figure out what the problem is. You go all that way, you spend all that time, spend all that money to go to Mars, and you abort to come home? I don't think so. I don't think anybody's going to want to do that. But colonizing Mars is going to be difficult. We don't understand enough about the surface, about the resources we can use there. We know some of them, but there's a mineral material called perchlorate that's in the Martian soils that we're going to have to understand. How do you deal with that if you're ever going to grow crops on Mars that we're familiar with at least? But again, I think we're going to figure out how to deal with the so-called perchlorate problem, and at some point in the distant future, we'll have human beings living on Mars. But that's going to be tough, and that's one of the reasons why I think we have to relearn how to work in deep space by going to the moon first. There's a lot of science to be done there, but the operational value of going to the moon, of learning how to solve some of these problems 3 days away from Earth rather than 9 months away from Earth, I think is going to be very, very important. And that right now seems to be the view of the current administration. Where are we? Yeah.
Why was the volcanic ash orange? Was it like the rust on Mars when in the iron, or was it just something different entirely?
Something different entirely made the volcanic ash orange. There was no oxidation of iron to make it orange, but the ratio of iron and titanium changes the color of things. The high titanium ash is orange, as it was at Apollo 17, but we have a low titanium ash that we found at Apollo 15, recognized relatedly, but nevertheless we have it in those samples, and that's a low titanium glass, and it's green. So depending on that ratio of iron and titanium in the glass, it will change the color. Okay?
How did it feel walking on the moon?
How did it feel? Well, physically, it felt like I was walking on a giant trampoline. Of course, 1/6 gravity, you're just as strong as you are here on Earth, but you can run like I did, like that, and that spacesuit was confining. I mean, it was pressurized. 3.7 pounds per inch pressure in that suit. But you could still maneuver it, and it was like being on a giant trampoline. Visually, again, I mentioned, we were in a magnificent valley. The scenery was just really something, pardon the expression, out of this world. The valley is deeper than the Grand Canyon. On the south side of the valley, the mountain South Massif was 7,000 feet high. On the north side, it was about 5,000 feet high. And just brilliantly illuminated by a sun as bright as in the New Mexico sun, of course, and a little bit brighter. But everything was placed against a black sky. That's what's hard to get used to. You go out, look at the Sandias, and it's against a blue sky, right, where the sun's up. Not on the moon. It's a black sky. And if there's anything hard to get used to, it was looking at a brilliantly illuminated mountain against a black sky. Now, I understand, I haven't been on the top of Everest, but I understand that that's something like you would see if you were on the top of Everest. The sky gets very black the higher you go here on Earth.
Photo question. With all the falls and the dust, were there any performance issues with your camera? As well, was it hard to focus given the gloves you were wearing or change the camera back? And how did you protect the film from the radiation?
That's our photo teacher, just by the way.
That's our photo teacher? Okay. All right. We had the Hasselblad camera. It had a 60 millimeter focal length. It was electric powered, the first Hasselblad, I guess probably the first camera that was electrically powered. Hasselblad donated those cameras to the space program. It had a passive thermal control only, and there was never enough radiation to damage the film. The one problem we had with film damage, a little bit, was that in the early cameras, the film came back and there were little electrical discharges along the sprockets. Well, we figured out how to deal with that, and so in later pictures, that was not a problem. The dust did not affect the camera. And it didn't affect any of our operating parts except the tools we were using. Anything that was exposed to the dust after a while would stop the work. But if you sealed it, you could hermetically seal, as one might say, you could keep the dust out. About 1% of that dust, though, is less than a micron in size, so it is very penetrating. And in fact, my suit, I've seen my suit a couple times in the Smithsonian, it is still gray. You can't even vacuum that dust out. It's in the fabric, the outer fabric of the suit. And that's one of the issues for you engineers in the future to deal with, is figure out how to reject that dust from the suit. It can be a problem, but I think there are engineering solutions to dealing with it. And so I don't worry about it. There's a bit of a cottage industry now that does. But I think those problems are going to be fairly straightforward in their solution. The lens did get dusty a little bit, but we had a little very fine brush that we carried with us, and every once in a while we just dust that lens off. And it never, and in fact, you can't see the dust problem on the film, even if it's there. And as far as focus is concerned, there was a little Mickey Mouse here, we call it, up on top of the camera that you had 5 different focus settings, and you just changed that. It had a very good depth of field, so that was good enough. It was a near focus and an intermediate focus and a distant focus.
When you were studying for your geology degree, did you ever expect that in the upcoming years you'd be on the moon?
No, I had no idea. I was an accident. People will say in many different ways I was an accident. When I was in graduate school at Harvard, there was starting to be some discussion about scientists being part of the astronaut program. But it was mostly outside of NASA. It turns out there were 2 or 3 people in NASA who thought that was a good idea. The National Academy of Sciences thought it was a good idea, particularly the head of the Space Science Board, Harry Hess. And those people finally got together, and in November of 1964, there appeared on the bulletin board at the Astrogeology Center in Flagstaff a notice, an announcement of opportunity that you could volunteer to be a science astronaut. And so I thought about 10 seconds, and raised my hand and volunteered. That was really the first real thought I had about actually becoming an astronaut. We joked about it at Harvard over a beer or 2, and that because the National Academy some years before had said the first person on the moon should be a hard rock geologist. Well, of course, that's what we were, and so we were ready to go. But it was really just a humorous discussion. And when the opportunity finally came along, well, I didn't hesitate, frankly. It seemed like a good idea at the time, and it still does.
After having dealt with the issues of balance and walking on the moon, is there any training that you think would help with it?
We did a little bit of training to get used to 1/6 gravity. You can balance some of your weight with springs and things like that in various apparatus. We also did the aircraft parabola flights. if you fly an airplane in a parabola, you can simulate weightlessness, and you change that trajectory a little bit, and you get 1/6 gravity. That's never very satisfying, but you get a little bit of feeling of what it's going to be like. You really don't adapt, but you adapt very quickly once you're there. And so it was not a major issue of adaptation. And we very soon realized it doesn't make any difference whether you fall or not. One, because you're not going to fall very hard in 1/6 gravity, like being a kid again, 1/6 your height. And the other thing is that you can get right back up. You just, as you saw, you either bend your legs and let the suit pressure push you up, or you just push up, do a good hard push up, and you're standing again. Just don't push too hard, or you'll be back on your back. Charlie Duke on Apollo 16 tried to make a demonstration of how high he could jump in front of the camera. Don't ever do anything in front of the camera. But one thing slipped his mind, and that is because of the backpack, your center of gravity is displaced about 2 inches to the back. And so when he jumped straight up, he actually rotated out of the picture and landed on his back. So you got to keep that in mind. And also, you probably noticed in the film that we were always leaning forward. Well, that's just a natural thing to get that center of gravity over your feet. And you'll learn to do that. On Mars, the gravity is 3/8 of Earth gravity, and so that won't be quite as much of an issue. But you get your balance back very quickly. The human brain and body adapt remarkably quickly to new situations, like being on the moon.
Do you think faster than light travel will be possible?
Probably, but I have no idea how you're going to do it. Neither did Einstein. But you know, physics is a remarkable field of study, and some of the things that we're seeing now in the universe through the Hubble Space Telescope and other terrestrial telescopes just make you wonder whether there is stuff going on that would enable you to get to warp speeds. Okay, now. But every time we do a test, it looks like the speed of light is a barrier. And in fact, this recent discovery of gravitational waves, which you probably discussed in some of your classes, showed that gravitational waves moved at the speed of light. Because we were fortunate enough, in order to observe figure out where those gravitational waves were coming from, because of a light signal we got here essentially simultaneously with the gravitational wave. So speed of light looks like a barrier. One of the interesting things, though, is that as you approach the speed of light relative to your peers, you don't age as fast. And that's going to be an interesting psychological thing to deal with if you ever come home. Anyway, got another one?
Yeah, my question is, what do you say to the people who believe the landing on the moon is fake?
Oh, I never paid much attention to it. I really don't. I mean, there are a lot of things to discuss, but that isn't one that is worth very much time. I'll tell you, Charlie Duke has a good answer, and that is, if we faked it, why did we do it 9 times? I mean, once should have been enough with the Cold War. Right? Yes. Well, who's next?
So when you were flying to the moon, what kind of specific food would you like to eat when you were traveling to space?
Oh, what kind of food did I like to eat? Well, by the time I flew in space, the food was getting to be pretty good. Most of it was in bags. It was dehydrated or freeze-dried. It was quite good. In fact, we had a freeze-dried orange juice that was excellent. Pulpy, once you added water, it was quite good. The best, though, were some food packs that we received from the Army. At that time, the Army had developed irradiated foods. They used a strontium 90, I think, a gamma producer to irradiate food so it would have a very, very long shelf life. And so we had what then were called wet packs. Now they're called MREs, and they aren't as good. But in those days, they were wet packs. And we had 4 types of wet packs. We had hot dogs, hamburger, peanut butter, and fruitcake. The fruitcake was outstanding. It really was. It was a high-protein fruitcake, and I could have lived on that fruitcake. It was just great. And the peanut butter, I love peanut butter. I still use it every day here. And so that was good. We had packed away some bread, but the bread got sort of stale after pretty quick. The one food, freeze-dried food we had that we started to use mainly for experiments. It wasn't because it was spoiled or anything like that, but salmon doesn't travel well. This was salmon salad, and it just it always appeared in our menus, even though we had supposedly had charge of our menus. We spent half a day developing the menu for the entire mission and choosing the various foods for each meal, and they were all tied together by fish line and in a compartment, and so the meals would come out in the order that we wanted them to. But for some reason, I think I know the reason, meals tended to have salmon salad in it, even though we hadn't ordered it. Well, that's because they couldn't get rid of it. Nobody wanted it. So they kept putting it back on the missions. And so we started to use it for experiments. And one of the experiments was to show the engineers that they hadn't solved all the problems of our fuel cells. Now, we had fuel cells that combined hydrogen and oxygen to produce electricity and water. The water we used on the mission came from these fuel cells. But a bit of hydrogen always got into the water through the catalytic bed that produced it. And so when you drank the water or mixed it in your food, you always got a little bit of hydrogen at the same time. And of course, what goes in has to come out, much to the discomfort of your crewmates, of course. So we, Ron Evans in particular, took a bag of salmon salad, rehydrated it, and then was able to get that hydrogen coalesced in a great big bubble. And he took pictures of it, and sort of, the engineers really didn't care, but nevertheless we took it back to them to prove that they hadn't solved all the problems. Where are we?
How did you feel when you landed on the moon? Excited, nervous?
How did I feel on the moon? Well, I two things. Extraordinarily honored and excited. And also, I couldn't get it out of my mind that in those year dollars, every minute cost about $1 million that you're on the moon. And so I figured we better work as hard as we could, as fast as we could to get the job done. So it was a whole combination of things. And in the middle of that, you're trying to assimilate this magnificent valley that I described to you in your mind, and so that you never forget it. And I've never forgotten any of it, I don't think. Well, I probably have. I've been in the process for several decades of writing sort of the story of Apollo 17. And in fact, my website, which is called americasuncommonssense.com, I've started to put chapters, almost at random, but still chapters of that diary, if you will, on, if anybody's interested in trying to find it. And every once in a while I run into something that I don't remember that. It's in the transcript. What are we talking about? And one of them was, we were up on the side of this North Massif, and the transcript has a whole bunch of almost coded language in it. Obviously, we were trying not to tell Houston what actually had happened. And I finally figured it out, what actually has happened is Commander Cernan, in getting back on the rover, what you do is the rover's over here, you stand at the side, and you sort of jump up into the vacuum and translate sideways. Well, he had caught his leg on the side of the rover and had fallen on his back next to a wheel. And he couldn't get up. And if there was a good reason to have a buddy around, it was right. He couldn't get. It just because normally if you're just on your back, you just roll over. But he couldn't roll up the slope of the mountain. It's 20 degree slope, and he couldn't roll against the wheel, so he was stuck. And it took me several days to finally figure out what in the world we were talking about. Because I was going over and I helped him get back up, of course. But for some reason, we didn't want to let Houston know that he had actually fallen and couldn't get up. Which would, if he's the one-man EVA, that's in trouble. What's next?
What was your favorite part about being, like, your experience on the moon? And if you could go back, would you go back?
Ooh, that's a very common question, and I don't have an answer because the whole experience was fantastic. It just was something that it's hard to sort out any one thing that is very special. Of course, actually landing on the moon and being an essential part of that was certainly a highlight. But the first time that I was able to get out on the moon and actually become the 12th man to step on the moon, that was something. I was coming down the ladder, and this exciting moment. I wanted to make sure I didn't slide down the ladder too fast. We didn't use the ladder as a ladder. We just would grab a hold of the sides and slide down. And my foot hit a boulder at the landing pad, and it had a lot of these glass beads on it, and it was like stepping on small ball bearings. And so, just as I started to let go of the ladder, my foot slid out from under me, and I thought, oh my goodness, first step on the moon, I'm going to fall. But I didn't. I recovered just because I had a hold of the ladder. But all of that, it just is awfully hard. The scientific discoveries were good. They're still coming today. The samples are the gift that keep on giving. There's a large community of lunar scientists, planetary scientists that continue to work on it. I go to the annual Lunar Planetary Science Conference in Houston. I'll be giving a major paper. We're having a special session on Apollo 17 all day this time. And so it's 45 years later. It's still a very, very important part of lunar science. And it's developing the basis, of course, for going back. How are we doing on time?
9 o'clock.
9 o'clock? A couple more questions, and then we'll...
That sounds good.
I have to fly to Florida this morning, so this is going to be a little short. We got 2 more questions.
When you were on the moon, did it feel like you were closer to the stars than when you were on the Earth?
I'm sorry, try again.
When you were on the moon, did it feel like you were closer to the stars than when you were on Earth?
Oh, when I was on the moon, did it feel like closer? No. In fact, you couldn't see the stars. The same reason you can't go outside right now and see the stars. Your eyes just can't pick out below that dynamic range, is what we call it. And now if you go down into a deep well today and look up, you'll see stars up there because all that other light has been filtered out. But the same on the moon. You couldn't see the stars, just a black sky. Now on the far side of the moon, when we were in the dark, or any time, not the far side or front side, when you're in the dark, the sun's blocked out. If you dark adapt, you can see the stars. In fact, they're magnificent view of stars, as well as sunrises. And I like to say that every time we were in orbit, we had an eclipse of the sun, because we did. And you got to watch the corona develop and the streamers come off, the diurnal light come off the sun. It really was quite remarkable. If you had dark adapted, if you didn't dark adapt, you could see it. One more? Yes, here we go.
What was the composition of the drill bit that you used to drill into the lunar surface, and how deep, and why did you have problems getting it out?
Okay. The drill bit itself, as I recall, was a very hard titanium steel. We drilled to just 3.2 meters depth. And that drilling in was not very difficult. But I have to tell you, getting that drill out was very difficult. And then I have to give you a little bit of geology here. The debris layer on the moon, which we call the regolith, is very closely packed. very high barrier strain. It's been impacted through millions of years by small meteors. It gets jostled, and it just ends up being very packed. If you tamp sand, you can sometimes get it to be very coarsely packed. And we had flutes on the drill. We had spiral flutes that, as you were drilling, would bring that material out. So getting down in the regolith was not much of a problem, unless you hit a rock, and you had to drill through the rock. And the bit could do that, but it would take a long time. We didn't have much of that. But there are rocks in the regolith. There are little rocks. And so when you start to bring it out, some of those rocks rotate into the flutes, but they can't go anywhere because it's so packed. And so they're jamming the drill stem. And we actually ended up having a jack. That's why I fell when you saw me there helping Gene. I was operating that jack, and if you get each thing, you get about an inch of core out. So that took quite a bit of time. But it's the only way we could force it out. In fact, on Apollo 15, it was such a problem that Dave Scott, he couldn't get it out, and put it initially, and he put his shoulder under the handle of the drill itself, and he actually ended up wrenching his shoulder. But they got it out, but it was a major problem. We never really got that right. And so it's a problem, for you engineers to work on in the future, is how do you drill a very densely packed regolith that also has fragments of rock in it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate very much your time and your questions. I hope you all have a chance to do what I did. Take care.